happy to have this opportunity to present my music to you all. And I, first of all, just want to very warmly thank Tanya Leon and Composers Now for having me on their Impact series. What I will do in the relatively brief amount of time that we have is, first of all, give you a background, and also discuss two of my recent works, which are concertos for both of my instruments. I have a piano concerto, Conjuring Tristan, that was premiered in 2015, and my theremin concerto entitled Sirens, which was premiered in 2019. So I'll talk about those. As well, I will mention the role of performance in my life, both as a pianist and as a thereminist, and how performance has informed my writing over the years. Also, I'll address a common theme that occurs throughout many of my works, which is one of quotation, which I employ quite a bit. First of all, about my background, I began very early. I often think of music as my native language, right along with English and Hebrew, in fact. I started playing the piano at age 3. My mother was my piano teacher. And while I never had a formal composition teacher during my early years, my mother really filled that role of being just such a brilliant and wise ear and providing feedback. The way I got into composition was a bit unusual. I started out as a pianist. I was slated to perform on a Mozart on a concert by the local orchestra in Rockland County, where I was brought up, and I happened to have written a series of piano pieces that the conductor of the orchestra was interested in. He asked me if I would consider orchestrating them, and it just struck me as such a natural sort of thing to do. And so my first orchestral work ended up being written when I was 8 years old. And after that experience, I was hooked. I had never studied orchestration, but basically through analyzing scores and going to lots of concerts and rehearsals and working with players directly over the years, I learned. So what I want to show you now is actually a very, very early work. I wrote this at age 9. It's a small excerpt. The work itself is about half an hour long. It's called In the Beginning, and it describes the biblical 7 days of creation. What you're going to hear is my description of birds from the 5th day. I should mention that I was coming into my own as a very young composer well before many of these really wonderful programs that now exist, for encouraging young female composers and before any of them were in existence. And so because there weren't role models of young women composers I knew of who I could relate to, I tended not to think of myself as a composer at that time. I thought of myself more as a writer of stories within music, a language with the same types of grammar and syntax as you would find in any language. I also think that music is the ultimate metaphor because it is a chameleon. It can be anything depending on the medium for which one writes. And when thinking about piano or orchestra, I tend to think more along the lines of oil painting or sculpture. In the case of the piano, I mean, you have a palette of, that's basically endless. 88 keys, 88 hues. You could combine them any way that you will, much as you can with an orchestra. I tend to experience writing both for piano and orchestra in a sort of similar way. I think the two are very symbiotic, at least for me, and feel that I relate to Debussy and Ravel very much because of this. I'm now going to play for you an excerpt from Responses, which is a piece that exists in two versions. There's a solo piano version and an orchestrated version. Responses was written as a musical commentary to 3 intermezzi of Brahms. The excerpt I'm going to play for you is my response to Brahms's E minor intermezzo, Opus 116, number 5. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just playing the opening of the Brahms. Then we're going to go into my solo performance, and then you'll hear the orchestral version. Some years after I premiered my piano work, I was approached by the conductor Emily Freeman Brown about orchestrating it for her orchestra, the Bowling Green Philharmonia. So you're going to hear now, or rather see now, an excerpt from the world premiere of that very same movement. I'd like to veer the discussion onto a completely different topic, that of the theremin. Back when I first began playing the piano, I was, when I was still extremely young, introduced to a brilliant pianist, Nadia Reisenberg. She happened to be my mother's piano teacher. The two of us became very close, even though I was so much younger than her. And she actually was responsible for my beginning to compose. And my very first piano works were all dedicated to her. She died when I was 8 years old, after which her sister, Clara Rockmore, took over in that very special role as mentor in my life. Clara is most known as the theremin virtuoso and muse of the inventor of the instrument. She started out as a violin prodigy. Unfortunately, due to tendinitis that she developed at age 17, she had to stop playing the violin. But she had studied with Leopold Auer, was in the same class as Jascha Heifetz, Nathan Mielstein. When she performed on the theremin, therefore, she tended to sublimate her violinistic inclinations into her playing in ways that no one ever since has been able to replicate. I first encountered the theremin when I would visit her for tea in her beautiful apartment near Carnegie Hall. There was always this very old 1930s radio-like structure in her living room. I took to it very naturally, and she began to teach me the instrument. What I'm going to do right now, before talking about my own music involving theremin, is to show you a performance of mine on the instrument. It's from a solo recital that I gave at Spectrum in 2013 with Melody Fader as the pianist. So as a performer, I would, and still do, kind of veer from one identity to the other. I would spend time as a pianist, then I would focus more on the theremin. There was a period where I was predominantly a thereminist, and this sort of corresponded to interestingly to the time when I was also very intensively immersed in academic work, both as a student and then as a professor. And so playing the theremin provided such a good balance, I think, because to perform the theremin is just such a very visceral experience. And so it served to connect me back to who I was as a composer. What I needed to do after a while, though, was to figure out how to reconcile all the different aspects of my identity, because I would get confused myself at times. How do I describe myself? Am I a composer pianist, a composer professor, a composer thereminist? So what I decided to do is combine the entities into one piece, perhaps aside from the professor part. I wrote a piece called Niskora in memoriam to Clara for 2 theremins and piano, in which I play all instruments, recording myself with using overdubbing. First of all, about the name, Niskora is has a bit of Hebrew wordplay. On one hand, it is a feminine take on the Yom Kippur Yizkor service. It means we will remember her. But also, Ora in Hebrew literally means a ray of light, which you could say is a translation of Clara's name. The recording that you're going to hear incorporates 2 very special instruments. One instrument that I'm playing was built for me by Bob Moog in 1991. It's a replica of Clara's own instrument that was customized for her by the inventor. The other instrument that I'm playing is, in fact, Clara's instrument. So they are playing against each other, in dialogue with each other. And then, of course, I'm accompanying myself on the piano as well. In 2016, I received a Guggenheim Fellowship to compose a theremin concerto, which was, for me, the ultimate opportunity to illustrate the full capacities of the theremin, not just the technical possibilities, but its romantic soul that the inventor felt so strongly that the instrument could convey, and that Clara conveyed so expressively. As an orchestrator, it also represented the ultimate way to use every sort of timbral blending you could imagine. The theremin blends with acoustic instruments in just endless possibilities. So it was so much fun to write. It's called Sirens. Each movement explores a different take on the term siren. The first movement is called Clara's Violin, and Clara was a siren, of course, and and it narrates her story through the use of leitmotifs. And I'm going to play for you Clara's leitmotif. And what you hear in the opening of the concerto is that very motif spread out through octave displacement. And it goes on, also illustrating leitmotif for the theremin, leitmotif for Nadia, her sister. There's even a piano leitmotif. I stick my name in there as well as a musical signature. You will hear an excerpt from the Albany Symphony's performance of the piece with Carolina Ake as soloist, and conducted by David Allen Miller. second movement of the concerto is entitled Ulysses. And what I do here is I address the story of Ulysses and the Sirens, but through Kafka's perspective. Kafka wrote a parable called The Silence of the Sirens, in which he maintained that even more punishing than the tempting, devastatingly tempting voices of the sirens itself was the silence, when the sirens would stop singing. The fun was really to experiment with silence and to see how I could use silence as a way of elevating tension. My ultimate dream always was to write a piano concerto that I would solo in. And in 2014, I did just that. I decided to address a novella written by Thomas Mann entitled Tristan. It's a young work of his where he is exploring, I think for the first time, that theme that comes up pretty often in later works, the irreconcilability between life and art. The way he presents this theme is through the form of Gabrielle, who's a young mother suffering from tuberculosis, who is a patient in a sanatorium. And while she's in the sanatorium, she meets a writer named Spinel, who is extremely fascinated by her and who encourages her to play through Wagner's Prelude and Liebestod for him, for she had once been a pianist. She does so and falls ill and dies sometime later. I was intrigued by this story for a few reasons. For one thing, being brought up Jewish, while I was extremely immersed in so much classical repertoire, Wagner, growing up, was a composer that, without exception, was taboo in our household. So that meant that I discovered Wagner many, many years later. And the idea of addressing Wagner, responding to him musically, tinkering with his harmonies as a composer, and as a Jewish composer, that really excited me. So initially I thought maybe it would be an opera, but what I gradually started realizing is that what excited me about this story was the scene where Gabrielle is playing the Wagner at the piano. So I thought, well, this has to be a cadenza, in which case a concerto would be perfect. I call it a narrative concerto. Perhaps it's something like Strauss's Don Quixote, and that the piano is our heroine, and we follow her experience through the work. You're going to hear an excerpt from the cadenza, which is also a fantasy on Wagner's leitmotifs from Tristan und Isolde. There's a wonderful sense of autonomy that one has when one is one's own performer. This really hit home this past year during the pandemic. It was such a trying experience for all of us, of course, and I found myself thinking about the ways that we connect to each other and to the world. The term love in English is pretty limiting because it applies to anything. And so I was interested in the Greek, the 7 terms for love that the Greeks have, each denoting a different archetype. So there's, for example, philia, friendship, love. There's storge, which is family love. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly. There's agape, which is idealism or altruistic love. There's patriotic love. There's eros. There's playful love. So what I did was I wrote a cycle entitled Different Loves, a series of portraits of each of these archetypes. Within the cycle, I weave my husband's name through, and I'm going to play you his leitmotif. And what I'll play for you is an excerpt from the concluding movement. which is entitled Acceptance. It's the movement describing self-love, philautia. I hope you enjoy, and thank you for listening.